Thank you, Mr. Chair. Does anyone disagree that our level of diversity in the military, at least according to race, exceeds that of the American public? We have more African Americans in the military than in the public. We have more Hispanics in the military than broadly in the population.
Congressman, that's generally true. It's not necessarily true if you look at all levels of
right. So that's what we tend to hear is yes, 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 but. That quick but, though, touches all kinds of things we do in recruiting and enlistment, DEI training, but that's kind of brushed aside. But the General Officers Corps, does anyone disagree that at least across the services, most of our general officers are chosen from within, for example, in the Army, combat ranks or the combat MOSs, and for a whole variety of reasons, we tend to see more minorities in the service and the service support, usually because there's different skills or different preferences there. So at least in my experience and what I've seen is that the generals are chosen from combat arms and they tend to tilt more towards men and they tend to tilt more towards white men. Reasonable explanation, one would say, right?
That's generally accurate.
Okay, so then we start skewing that percentage. Mr. Levine, what then in our General Officer Corps, since it tends to be less diverse, is acceptable? Is it to match the population?
I don't believe that there is a percentage that's an acceptable percentage. I think that as we look at the type of factor that you just described, the reaction of the military has been a reasonable one, which is, why are we seeing minority officers go into support functions? Are there things we can do?
Support functions less important?
Not necessarily, but are there things that we can do in terms of mentorship or encouragement to persuade them that perhaps they should look at the combat arms functions as well, because if they're as you indicate, if they're more strongly represented in the lower grades in those functions, they're more likely to fleet up to the upper levels, and that is the kind of action that we take to encourage diversity.
So how do we then do that for females in general officers? Let's just stick with that because there's all kinds of places we could go with that, but let's stick with that. How then do we do that? Do we encourage more females particularly when physical fitness and the ability to perform to a certain standard is a key metric, let's say in Army combat arms, infantry, armor, what have you?
You don't necessarily have the full ability to do that with regard to women, and you have to defer to what which
would you agree then that really what it's about is about standards? And it should be, if we have a meritocracy, and we've had some definition of meritocracy, it's about standards, period. It's the standard needed to be an infantryman or woman. That may be a different, as it applies to physical, than it would be to, say, be a cyber warrior. We have different physicality needed to be in the infantry than a type on a keyboard.
Yes, Congressman, we have physical standards for specific MOSs, and those standards do not vary based on whether you're a woman or a man.
Actually, they do. Actually, that's just blatantly incorrect. We have a dual standard. Myself and Tom Cotton have legislation to make them gender neutral and to make them according to the standard required.
Let me be clear. We have two different fitness standards. We have one fitness standard for an MOS. Those are two different things. The fitness standard is a general suitability to serve in the service, which you'll hear you can ask the professionals in the next panel, but they'll explain to you that's about your general standard of fitness. Right. There's a separate standard, which is a standard for a combat arms MOS, and that does not vary. It does not vary based on gender.
But here's the issue with that. In order for promotion points and all kinds of other things, for example, you have a first female that goes through Ranger School, one standard, proud of her, absolutely earned it, but she goes to command an infantry platoon and she has a now different physical standard than the men and women that she's asked to lead. That's unfair to her, that undermines her achievement. And last I checked, the enemy's bullets don't make a distinction.
So again, she had to pass the same standard to get through Ranger School. She didn't get a different standard through Ranger School. She had the same standard through Ranger School.
That's right, as it should be.
She has a different fitness standard, which you'd think of as a health standard as a woman.
No.
Body weight is different.
No, it's called it's deliberately called a combat fitness test. These are the standards you must hit for combat. The Army literally changed the name from physical fitness test, which is wellness and health, to a combat fitness test. And I think frankly, I'm going to move on, but you're making a distinction without a difference there. And at the end of the day, what I think we need to settle, and why this committee under the chairman's leadership is having so many hearings, it's about standards that we need to win and fight wars, not about all of these other factors.
I agree with you, Congressman.